This PowerPoint was developed by Christy Austin, Sam Gessel, and Katie Leonard after watching the video of Dr. Marcia Barnes. Here's an overview of our PowerPoint. We're going to talk about the main points from the video. What is Dr. Barnes' perspective? Fitting Dr. Barnes' perspective into the perspectives of other researchers. Our remaining questions. And finally, we'll end with our personal perspectives, where we agree and disagree with Dr. Barnes.
Okay, so when our group spoke about Dr. Barnes' video, we thought that the content could be distilled into 4 main points. So first of all, Dr. Barnes aligns herself more with the nomothetic way of thinking about intensive interventions. She talked about how this tendency to consider nomothetic approaches to intervention relates to her belief that there really are a limited number of ways to carve up cognition. So in that, she means that there's only so many different underlying causal factors for disabilities, there's only so many different ways to divvy up systems of development, and there are only so many things that the brain is set up to do at any given time. Second, Dr. Barnes spoke about the slight difference between performance and learning. She talked about how maybe there are emotional or cognitive attributes or non-cognitive considerations like anxiety and motivation that are more important for performance rather than learning, and that there are also interactions between these non-cognitive factors and neurocognitive systems like working memory. For example, she spoke about how anxiety is an area that influences both attention and working memory, and we need to do more research into this interaction, particularly as it relates to ways to improve the outcomes for our most struggling learners. Then related to this, Dr. Barnes believes that research should consider principles of learning for laying down foundations for long-term representation and retrieval of information. And she thinks we should be manipulating these areas, so changing the learning context in ways that align with cognitive research so that maybe we'll be able to better meet the needs of students with the most intensive needs. Dr. Barnes' third main point related to cognitive skills training. As of now, research into interventions that include cognitive skills training haven't found significant effects. But Dr. Barnes believes this is because, unlike academic interventions, which we have a fairly decent understanding of the intensity, duration, dosage, effect size, and the scope and sequence needed for an effect, we don't have that same understanding for cognitive skills training. And we need to know those details, especially if we want to figure out the dosage and effect size needed to see if cognitive training might have a generalized or cascading effect on response to academic interventions. Looking at this could give us a better understanding of how we could create effective combined interventions. Finally, Dr. Barnes spoke about treatment by aptitude interactions. She talked about the importance of finding the correct area of moderator to treatment effect so that we can best understand the ways in which the effect of a treatment depends on the level of another variable, such as, say, scores of reading comprehension or working memory capacity. With a better understanding of these interactions, we can begin thinking about making small tweaks or changes to interventions to make them more salient for non-responders. This gets at the concern that maybe we can't really change cognitive resources like we would hope with cognitive skills training, but we could still alter the learning context in a way that better supports students with deficits in areas of maybe attention or working memory. We need to be experimentally manipulating these changes so that we can figure out the causal mechanism of change. We also need to think about treatments that have tapped into moderated treatment effects and have made treatments more effective for non-responders, and figure out what these treatments have in common with each other so we can better understand these interactions as a whole. Overall, these 4 areas, Dr. Barnes' nomothetic tendency, the distinction she made between performance and learning, the importance of the area of cognitive skills training, and then also treatment by aptitude interactions, are the 4 main points of Dr. Barnes' video. They definitely give us a lot to think about in terms of this module and beyond for the future of educational research as a whole.
Dr. Barnes leaned toward a nomothetic viewpoint, but as she talked, it seemed she would agree with Lee Swanson that these viewpoints aren't so much an either-or thing and really might depend more on your research question. She also seemed to find it important that intensive interventions dive into investigate teaching to cognition. Dr. Barnes and Dr. Coyne both spoke about reading interventions in a similar way, discussing how there are certain profiles of struggling readers. Dr. Coyne described this by discussing how there are students that struggle with decoding, and then there are students that struggle with language and comprehension. These students would need intensive interventions that were unique from the other group, but could possibly be grouped with other students and provided an intensive intervention that could be successful. Dr. Barnes described this same idea by stating that there are only so many ways to talk about teaching a child to read. It seems like these two share a similar perspective on the ability to intensify interventions in ways that would generally meet the needs of groups of students. When Dr. Barnes was explaining her perspective and area of focus, I felt like she might align nicely with the viewpoints of the authors of reading number 5 in Module 4 on single case design. While she stated that she's generally more nomothetic, she also discussed how she believes that we don't necessarily need to conduct large randomized controlled trials to experimentally test and determine what the active ingredients are in the interventions that are currently working for students with academic deficits, in addition to struggles in areas like attention. In Reading 5 in Module 4, the authors propose that brief experimental analysis of behavior can be effective in helping students make academic gains in the area of reading fluency. For 2 of the students in this single case design, the behavior targeted was finger tracking, as the students made frequent errors while reading, such as skipping over words or lines. For 1 other student, the behavior identified was modeling, and the intervention demonstrated that since the student had trouble attending to instruction, modeling shorter segments of text was especially helpful. Perhaps this was the type of research Dr. Barnes was referencing that she felt might be helpful in starting to strengthen our knowledge about what works in domain-specific cognitive training. Researchers working with students with low-incidence disabilities might disagree with the perspective of Dr. Barnes. While Dr. Barnes recognizes that students have unique profiles of learning and needs, she believes that students can be grouped together and that interventions can be designed to meet the needs of students with similar profiles. I would imagine that researchers working with students with more severe cognitive impairments or developmental disabilities might find it challenging to implement identical interventions to multiple students with successful outcomes, as more severe intellectual disabilities and the behavioral and communication challenges that often accompany developmental disabilities might require individualizing that is truly unique to their own needs, functional levels, and preferences.
Remaining questions. Dr. Barnes referred to specific engineering principles that need to be included in the instructional design of interventions. What are these engineering principles, and how could we tweak them to reach high-risk learners? Learner versus learning context. Dr. Barnes brought up an interesting point. In terms of long-term representation, have we looked closely at the learning context in order to manipulate effective change?
In the following 3 slides, our group members will each discuss where we believe we fall on the continuum of being either idiographic or nomothetic. Idiographic approaches place the focus on the characteristics of unique individuals, like we commonly see in research studies utilizing DBI or single case designs. Nomothetic approaches place the focus on universal characteristics of larger groups of students and focus on general principles of learning. Individuals who are more nomothetic tend to believe that many people learn the same way. In addition to placing ourselves along this continuum, we will discuss areas in which we agree, disagree, or had further questions related to Dr. Barnes' perspective. I believe I am primarily nomothetic. We can group students by strengths and deficits and create interventions that can be generally effective for groups of students with similar profiles. I am slightly idiographic when thinking about how to intensify an intervention in a way that might be particular or unique to an individual student. I agree with Dr. Barnes that learning and performance are different. I think performance has become a large focus of schools today with state assessments, but I also think it's primarily what we are measuring in most research studies when there's no follow-up assessment conducted. Perhaps we need to look at this if the goal is for students to maintain gains they have made. A question I'm left thinking about after hearing Dr. Barnes' perspective is how she feels about the idea of cognitive skills impacting learning in addition to their impact on performance.
Before this module, I may have classified myself more as idiographic. In the field of special education, we tend to think about the individual student needs. However, after listening to Dr. Sagai, Dr. Coyne, Dr. Simonson, and Dr. Barnes, I started to formulate a more nomothetic approach. Dr. Barnes brought up the point that there are only so many ways we can carve out cognition. So there are only so many ways we can teach a child to read. This connects to the features of effective instructional design, brought up by Dr. Sagai, Dr. Coyne, and Dr. Simonson, and how we can take these features and intensify them for struggling learners. I agree with Dr. Barnes in that we need to look more closely at the interaction between cognitive training and skill-specific training. For example, we need to look at attention and provide training and try to discover if there is transfer to skill-specific training. Dr. Barnes implemented a study with pre-K students with very low knowledge who also had attention difficulties. The intervention approach focused on the cognitive training to improve attention, and the question asked, will this improvement link to mathematical learning? Even though they found little effects, I still think there's more research to be done in this area. I also agree that there are only so many ways to carve human cognition. What I would like to explore further, Dr. Barnes believes that we need to look more closely at language interventions. Can we manipulate language? And if so, are there cascading effects for other skills for academic development?
When it comes to placing myself in the nomothetic versus ideographic debate, I think that I really walk the line. I have a hard time choosing one side over the other. In many ways, that's because I think it's so important to start with the nomothetic approach to get this big picture of creating an intensive intervention that addresses the needs of a large group of individuals with intensive needs. And then for non-responders to these effective interventions, it's important to take a more ideographic approach in order to better determine the specific adaptations needed to elicit a response from these learners. So on one hand, I agree with Dr. Barnes in a lot of her points. So first of all, I strongly agree with her belief that we need to look more at moderators and we need to look at cognitive skill training, all these things in terms of creating combined interventions that can be more effective for our learners. And then I also agree that it's important to consider performance factors versus learning factors and to sort of distinguish between those 2 points. And lastly, maybe most importantly, I agree that there's only a certain number of ways that you can carve up cognition. And I think that it's important to kind of figure out those different ways and the different combinations to craft the best, most effective interventions we can. Then, on the other hand, there's one point that I don't know if I necessarily disagree with Dr. Barnes, but I view it in a slightly different way. And that's this idea that the changes in learning context that Dr. Barnes spoke about, both within the idea of principles of learning and then also when discussing more deeply the interactions that might exist, I think those changes in learnings are adaptations. And I think that they are the intensifications and individualizations that we've seen that's inherently part of the DBI process. And in that way, I view those slight changes as ideographic, and I think that those changes are more numerous, and there's a far greater number of combinations that you could work with that could more specifically individualize an intervention for a specific student.